The world outside the great stone arches of the Chicago Public Library was a symphony of chaos. It was a roar of Ford Model T engines, the brash cry of newsboys hawking the latest scandal, and the distant, syncopated heartbeat of a jazz band spilling from some hidden speakeasy. But inside, within the hallowed halls of marble and polished oak, the only permissible sound was the rustle of a turning page, a soft cough muffled behind a gloved hand, and the gentle whisper of a world content to be forgotten by the clamor of 1925. This was Hazel Abbott's sanctuary. For her, the library was not merely a place of employment. It was a fortress built of paper and ink, its walls fortified by the silent promises of 1,000 different lives. Each spine on the shelves was a doorway to a place where logic reigned, where passions were eloquently declared, and where endings, happy or tragic, were always neat and conclusive. Her own life mirrored this order. Her dark hair was always pinned in a tidy chignon at the nape of her neck. Her simple, long-sleeved dress was always impeccably pressed, and her days were measured by the satisfying stamp of the due-date press and the quiet contentment of a book returned to its rightful place. She found a profound peace in this predictability, a balm for a spirit that shied away from the loud, aggressive ambitions of the roaring 20s, while other girls her age were rolling their stockings down and dancing the Charleston with reckless abandon. Hazel was cataloguing poetry and dreaming of English countrysides she'd only visited through the words of the Brontë sisters. Her world was safe, her world was known, until the day the shadow fell across it. He did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the unnerving silence of a predator. Hazel first noticed him as a presence, a subtle shift in the library's gentle atmosphere. He stood near the entrance, a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He was dressed in a suit of such fine dark wool that it seemed to absorb the light around it. A grey fedora was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the sharp cut of his jaw, the severe line of his mouth. He was utterly out of place. The men who frequented her domain were soft-shouldered academics or earnest young clerks, their hands smudged with ink. Not this. This man looked as though he were carved from granite and secrets. He removed his hat, revealing a thick crop of black hair, and for a moment his eyes swept the grand reading room. They were not the eyes of a man looking for a book. They were the eyes of a man assessing a territory, cataloguing its weaknesses, its exits, its assets. Then they found her. His gaze was not lecherous or flirtatious. It was something far more unsettling. It was heavy. It felt like a physical weight, a steady, unblinking appraisal that seemed to see past the librarian's modest dress and right into the sheltered, trembling heart beneath. A flush crept up her neck, hot and unwelcome. She quickly looked down, her fingers fumbling with the cards she was sorting, her practiced composure suddenly a fragile veneer. He did not approach. He simply walked to a secluded oak table in a far corner, one that offered a clear view of the circulation desk, and sat down. He placed his hat on the table and folded his hands before him, and he watched. For the rest of the afternoon, Hazel worked under the pressure of that silent scrutiny. Every stamp of her press seemed too loud, every whisper to a patron a foolish twitter. She tried to ignore him, to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of her work, but it was impossible. He was a discordant note in her perfectly composed symphony. She could feel his gaze on her back as she reshelved books, a prickling sensation between her shoulder blades. She could feel it on her hands as she mended a torn page, making her movements clumsy. Her colleague, Mildred, a woman whose appetite for gossip was insatiable, sidled up to her, pretending to look for a misplaced card. "See the fella in the corner," she whispered, her voice buzzing with excitement. "That's him. That's Arthur Vance. The name meant nothing and everything. It wasn't a name you read in the society pages, but one you heard in hushed, fearful tones on street corners. Arthur the Ghost Vance. A man who had risen from the muck of the South Side to control a shadowy empire of speakeasies, gambling dens and smuggling routes. A man rumored to have made rivals disappear with nothing more than a quiet command. He was a ghost because he was rarely seen, his influence a phantom hand guiding the city's illicit currents. "What's he doing here?" Hazel whispered back, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked beat against her ribs. "Gangsters don't read Dickens. Don't you see, honey?" Mildred's eyes were wide. "He's not here for the books. He's here for you." The suggestion was so preposterous that Hazel almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. She risked a glance at him. He hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic calm, but his eyes, they were still fixed on her. There was no mistaking it. This was not a coincidence. The next day, he was there again, and the day after that. His routine was as methodical as her own. He would arrive at 2 o'clock, take the same seat, and remain until she began to tidy her desk for closing time. He never brought a newspaper, never opened a book. His sole occupation was watching her. The library, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage. The patrons, the shelves, the very dust motes dancing in the sunbeams were all props in a silent, terrifying play in which she was the unwilling lead. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else began to stir, something she was deeply ashamed to acknowledge, a flicker of fascination. He was a character ripped from the pages of a forbidden book. She, who lived her life by rules and order, found herself transfixed by this man who so clearly lived by none. She began to notice the small details, the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his powerful hands, which could surely crush a man's throat, lay perfectly still and relaxed on the polished table, and his eyes. When the light caught them just right, she saw past the cold assessment. She saw a profound, world-weary melancholy, a deep-seated loneliness that seemed entirely at odds with the violent world he commanded. It was a look she recognized from the tragic heroes of her novels, and it called to the most foolish, romantic part of her soul. One rain-slicked Thursday, as she was reaching for a heavy volume of cartography on a high shelf, her fingers slipped. The book, bound in heavy leather and brass, tumbled from her grasp. She gasped, flinching as it fell, but it never hit the floor. He had moved with a swift, silent grace that was shocking in a man of his size. He was there, having crossed the entire room in a few long strides, one hand easily catching the book mid-air. He stood before her, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive soap and the crisp autumn air clinging to his coat. The library fell away. The whispers and the shuffling feet ceased to exist. There was only the immense, solid presence of him and the space between them, crackling with unspoken tension. He held the book out to her. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. His gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "Be careful," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into her very bones. It was the first time he had spoken to her. As she reached for the book, her fingers brushed against his. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle, but a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flaming. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something: surprise, satisfaction. She couldn't tell. The mask of impenetrable calm fell back into place almost instantly. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his table, leaving her trembling in the aisle, the heavy book clutched to her chest like a shield. He left at his usual time, melting into the grey dusk of the city as silently as he had arrived. But this time, he left more than just an unnerving presence behind. He left the echo of his voice in the quiet air, the phantom sensation of his touch on her skin. That night, Hazel could not find solace in her books. The measured prose of Jane Austen felt insipid. The heroic couplets of Pope seemed hollow. Every hero seemed a pale imitation, every villain a clumsy caricature of the man with the sad eyes and the silent watch. Her safe, predictable world had been breached. A whisper of the wild, chaotic city had followed a shadow through the library doors, and it had spoken her name. She locked the front door of her small apartment, but she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that the real danger was already inside. The silence that followed was, in its own way, more unnerving than his presence had been. For a week, Arthur Vance did not return to the library. The corner table remained empty, a void in the room that drew Hazel's eye a dozen times an hour. The quiet sanctuary, once a source of comfort, now felt incomplete, charged with an expectant energy that frayed her nerves. She told herself she was relieved. She told herself she was safe. But the calm she had so carefully cultivated for years refused to settle. She felt as though she were holding her breath, waiting for a storm that had gathered on the horizon to finally break. And then it did. Not with thunder and lightning, but with the sharp, authoritative knock on the door of her small apartment on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't him. It was two uniformed policemen, their faces grim under the dim light of the hallway gas lamp. Their presence in the quiet, respectable building was a scandal in itself. Her father, a mild-mannered bookkeeper named Hazel Abbott, stood behind them in the doorway of his own apartment across the hall, his face ashen, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. "Miss Abbott," the taller officer asked, his voice devoid of warmth, "we need you to come with us. It's about your father." The world tilted on its axis. The events of the next few hours were a blur of cold precinct benches, the acrid smell of stale cigar smoke, and words, ugly, impossible words, that did not seem to connect to the gentle man she knew. Embezzlement, falsified ledgers, a sum of money so vast it made her feel faint. The company her father had served faithfully for 30 years was accusing him of systematically stealing from them. He denied it, of course, his voice a bewildered, trembling whisper, but the evidence, they said, was insurmountable. He was a lamb caught in a wolf trap. They released him on bail, a sum secured by the deed to their modest building, the only thing of value her family possessed. When they returned home, the truth came out in a torrent of shame and despair. Howard, in a desperate attempt to cover a series of failed investments urged on him by a supposed friend, had taken out a loan, not from a bank, but from a man whose name was only ever spoken in whispers, a loan shark with connections to the city's darkest corners. The debt had spiraled, the interest compounding with predatory speed. The embezzlement charge, he swore, was a frame-up, a way for his creditors to seize everything. "How much, Papa?" Hazel asked, her own voice trembling as she clutched his shaking hands. He finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a lifetime of regret. The number he uttered was so catastrophic, so utterly beyond their means, that it felt like a physical blow. They were ruined, more than ruined. Her father would go to prison, and they would be cast out onto the street, branded with a disgrace they could never erase. For 2 days they existed in a state of suspended terror. Hazel went to the library, moving through her duties like an automaton, the familiar comfort of her books now offering no solace. The neat conclusions and just resolutions within their pages felt like a cruel mockery of her own chaotic reality. Every slan of her due date press sounded like a gavel falling on her father's life. On the third night, as she sat numbly at her small kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills that were now the least of her worries, another knock came at the door. It was a soft, deliberate sound, nothing like the police. Her heart seized in her chest. She knew, with a chilling certainty, who it was. She opened the door, and he was there. Arthur Vance stood on her threshold, his large frame filling the narrow doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the cramped hallway. He wore a dark overcoat, raindrops glistening on the broad shoulders, and held his grey fedora in his hands. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes, those intense, melancholy eyes, met hers with a look of profound seriousness. "Miss Abbott," he said, his low baritone voice the same one that had haunted her thoughts, "may I come in?" It was not a question. She stepped back, a puppet whose strings he already held, and he entered her home. The small, neat apartment, her last bastion of safety, seemed to shrink around him. He was a lion in a canary's cage. He surveyed the room with a quick, comprehensive glance. The worn but clean furniture, the shelf of her favorite novels, the framed photo of her mother on the mantelpiece. "I have heard of your father's troubles," he began, his voice calm, measured. He was not here to offer condolences. He was here to transact. "How?" she breathed, though she already knew the answer. A man like him had eyes and ears everywhere. He ignored the question. The men he owes money to, they are not forgiving, and his employers are pressing charges with unnatural enthusiasm. He will be convicted. He will die in Joliet prison. Each word was a precise, calculated strike, dismantling what little hope she had left. He was laying her desperation bare, forcing her to look at it. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice stronger now, laced with a fear that was hardening into defiance. He took a step closer. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "I am in a unique position, Miss Abbott. I am, perhaps, the only man in Chicago who can make all of this disappear. The debt erased, the charges dropped, the evidence lost. Your father's name will be cleared, his reputation restored. He will be safe. Your family will be secure." A fragile, treacherous hope flickered within her. Why? Why would you do that? Here it was, the price. His gaze was unwavering, and in its depths she saw an unnerving mix of possession and resolve. "Because you will come with me," he said simply. The air crackled. The trap was sprung. It wasn't about money. It was about her. The weeks of silent observation, in the library, the single charged touch, it had all been a prelude to this. He was a collector, and he had found an object he wished to acquire. "Come with you," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "As what?" Your mistress." The word, scandalous and ugly, hung in the air between them. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of emotion on his stoic face. "The terms are not for discussion tonight. You will have everything you need. You will be cared for. But your life here, this life," he gestured vaguely at her small, book-filled world, "will be over. You will belong to me." The bluntness of it stole her breath. He wasn't trying to charm or persuade her. He was stating a fact, a transfer of ownership. She thought of her father, of his kind, worried face crumbling into ruin. She thought of the shame, the poverty, the utter hopelessness of their situation. Arthur Vance was not offering her a choice. He was offering her the only available path that did not lead over a cliff. It was a gilded cage, but the alternative was a slaughterhouse. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of rage, of utter, helpless defeat. She was a character in a grim novel she could not close, her fate decided by a dark and powerful author. "If I do this," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you will swear my father will be safe, that he will never know of this arrangement." "You have my word," Arthur Vance said, and in the underworld his word was said to be ironclad. She closed her eyes, taking one last moment to be Hazel Abbott, the quiet librarian. When she opened them, that girl was gone, replaced by a sacrifice. "Yes," she said, the word was a surrender, a death sentence, a flicker of something relief. triumph, passed through his eyes before the mask descended once more. Pack a small bag. Only what is essential. A car is waiting. He gave her no time for farewells, no moment to grieve the life she was leaving. He waited in the living room while she moved mechanically through her bedroom, pulling a simple dress, a hairbrush, a single treasured book of poetry from her shelf. She took one last look in the mirror at the pale, terrified girl staring back at her. Then she walked out, closing the door on her own ghost. The car waiting outside was not a common Ford, but a gleaming black Packard, its engine purring with a low, intimidating growl. A chauffeur held the door open. The interior was plush velvet, a world away from the rattling streetcars she was used to. As she sank into the seat, Arthur sat beside her, the space between them humming with a silent, oppressive power. The Packard pulled away from the curb, gliding silently through the familiar streets of her neighborhood before turning towards the grand boulevards that lined the lakefront. They drove north, towards a part of the city she had only seen in pictures, where sprawling mansions stood like fortresses behind iron gates and manicured lawns. Finally, they turned into a long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees that blocked out the city lights. A magnificent stone mansion loomed before them, its windows blazing with electric light, a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded it. It was beautiful, imposing, and utterly forbidding. The car stopped. The chauffeur opened her door. Arthur Vance got out and stood waiting for her, a dark silhouette against the bright promise of a luxurious prison. He held out his hand. Trembling, she placed her own in his. His grip was firm, inescapable. He led her up the grand stone steps to a massive oak door, which swung open as they approached. As she crossed the threshold, the door clicked shut behind her with a sound of chilling finality, the sound of a key turning in a lock, the sound of her old life ending, and a new, terrifying one beginning. The days that followed were a strange, gilded torment. Hazel was not a prisoner in a dungeon, but a rare bird in an impossibly ornate cage. The mansion was a palace of polished marble floors, soaring ceilings dripping with crystal chandeliers, and silent, ghost-like servants who appeared at her elbow with trays of food she couldn't eat and glasses of water she drank with a trembling hand. They addressed her as Miss Abbott with unnerving deference, their eyes always averted, their movements fluid and practiced. They were her jailers, their courtesy more menacing than any iron bar. Her room was a masterpiece of feminine luxury, with a silk-draped four-poster bed, a vanity table laden with crystal bottles of French perfume, and a wardrobe filled with exquisite dresses of crêpe de chine and beaded silk that she refused to touch. They were the livery of a kept woman, and she would not wear them. She remained in her own simple librarian's dress, a pathetic act of defiance that felt like the only piece of herself she had left. The most terrifying part of this new existence was the waiting. Each evening, she would lie rigid in the enormous bed, her ears straining against the profound silence of the house, listening for his footstep in the hall. She was certain he would come to claim his purchase, to demand the physical surrender that must surely be the final term of their cruel bargain. She would clutch the heavy book of poetry she had brought with her, its spine a flimsy weapon against the dread that consumed her. But the footstep never came. The handle of her door, which she locked each night with a shaking hand, never turned. Arthur Vance was an enigma. He was a constant, powerful presence in the house. She would feel the shift in atmosphere when he returned, in the late hours, but he remained a ghost. She would glimpse him from a window, a tall figure in a dark coat, crossing the manicured lawns, or hear the low rumble of his voice from behind the closed doors of his study. He made no demands of her, issued no commands. He simply left her to marinate in a state of luxurious, terrifying limbo. Was this another form of torture, to leave her suspended in fear, waiting for a blow that never fell. The uncertainty was a poison, seeping into her thoughts, making her jump at every creak of the old house. She was his possession, a thing he had acquired and stored away, and the not knowing was beginning to unravel her. On the 5th day, as she was staring listlessly out of the drawing-room window at a landscape of grey weeping willows, he finally broke the silence. "Miss Abbott." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing in the doorway, watching her with that same intense, unreadable expression. He was dressed not in one of his severe suits, but in dark trousers and a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a surprising strength. He looked younger, less like a gangster, and more like a man burdened by the weight of his own house. "I imagine this has not been easy for you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You must have questions." She stared at him, mute. 1,000 questions screamed in her mind, but her tongue felt thick and useless. "What do you want from me? When will this torture end?" He seemed to understand her silence. "There is something I want to show you," he said. "A part of this house I think you will ... appreciate." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. This was it. He was leading her to the slaughter. Yet she found herself nodding, unable to resist the quiet authority in his voice. He led her not up the grand staircase towards the bedrooms, but down a long, quiet corridor she hadn't yet explored. He stopped before a set of tall, imposing doors of dark, carved mahogany and produced a heavy brass key from his pocket. The lock turned with a satisfying, deep-throated click. He pushed the doors open and stood back, gesturing for her to enter. Hazel stepped across the threshold, and the breath left her body in a silent gasp. She was standing in a library, but it was not like any library she had ever seen. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories high, the room was walled from floor to ceiling with shelves of glowing mahogany, all of them overflowing with leather-bound volumes. A rolling ladder leaned against one wall, promising access to the highest, most distant treasures. Sunlight streamed through a vast, arched window at the far end of the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. In the center of the room, 2 deep, worn leather armchairs faced a great stone fireplace where a low fire crackled, casting a warm, flickering glow on the thousands of silent spines. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax, the scent of heaven itself. For a moment she forgot who she was, where she was, and who had brought her there. She was a librarian in the presence of greatness. Her fear dissolved, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated awe. Her fingers itched to run along the bindings, to read the gilded titles, to breathe in the history contained in this magnificent room. "It was my father's." Arthur's voice came from behind her, startling her back to reality. "He wasn't a good man, but he loved books. It is the only part of him I chose to keep." She turned to look at him. In the warm, gentle light of the library, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. The melancholy in his eyes was no longer a fleeting impression. It was a profound, tangible sorrow. The monster had receded, and in his place stood a man. "Why did you bring me here?" she whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. He walked past her, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug, and ran a hand along a row of books, his touch surprisingly reverent. "Because this is the only honest place in my life," he said without looking at her, "and I owe you some honesty." He finally turned to face her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You asked me if I'd brought you here to be my mistress. The answer is no." Hazel stared, her mind struggling to process the words. "No, a mistress is a transaction," he said, his voice low and laced with a bitterness that shocked her. "A temporary amusement. I have no need for that. My life is full of transactions, Miss Abbott. They are hollow, empty. I own half the speakeasies in this city. I have politicians in my pocket, and I can buy any car, any jewel, any building I desire. But it all means nothing." He gestured around the library, at the silent, waiting books. "This is my only inheritance, and it is a legacy of one. I have no one to leave it to, no one to share it with. My name is built on fear and violence. When I am gone, it will turn to dust." He took a slow step towards her, his eyes pleading, desperate in a way she never would have imagined possible. "I did not bring you here to be my lover, Hazel. I brought you here to be my wife." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Wife? The idea was so insane, so utterly beyond the realm of possibility, that she felt a dizzying sense of unreality. "I watched you in the library," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "for weeks. I saw the way you lived, quiet, puissant. You live in a world of order and beauty, a world of meaning. Everything my world is not. I don't want your body. I want your ... presence. I want to come home to a house that isn't just stone and shadows, but has a light in it. I want to sit in this room with someone who understands what it means." He stopped, standing a few feet from her, a chasm of experience and violence separating them. "I want a family," he confessed, the words raw, exposed. "A real one. Something clean to build from the filth of my life. A legacy of love to wash away the blood." Hazel could only stare, her heart hammering against her ribs. This changed everything. The gilded cage was not a brothel. It was meant to be a home. The terrifying gangster was not a predator seeking a victim, but a desperately lonely man trying to buy a soulmate. He had trapped her, manipulated her, and ripped her from her life, but he had done it not out of lust, but out of a profound, aching loneliness she had sensed from the very beginning. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The part of her that was Howard Abbott's daughter, the respectable librarian, was screaming in outrage at the audacity, the arrogance of the man. He thought he could just orchestrate a life, manufacture a wife. But another part of her, the part that had lost itself in the tragic stories of Heathcliff and Mr. Rochester, felt a flicker of impossible, dangerous empathy. She saw the little boy who had inherited this room from a man he could not love. She saw the man who had everything and nothing. He had committed a terrible crime against her freedom, but the motive was the stuff of the very novels that lined these walls. A desperate, misguided, and deeply human yearning for connection. Double quotes, she started, but no words came. "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly, as if afraid of what she might say. He retreated, putting distance between them again. "This room is yours. Come here whenever you wish. It is the only place in this house where you will find no locks." He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "I will not touch you, Hazel," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded strange and intimate in his low voice. "Not unless you wish it. I made you my captive. I will not also make you my prisoner." And with that he was gone, closing the heavy doors behind him, leaving her alone in the magnificent, silent library. She stood there for a long time, surrounded by a million stories, her own suddenly the most unbelievable of them all. She was no longer just a possession. She had been given a title, a role in a drama she didn't understand. She was to be the wife of Arthur Vance, the light in his darkness, and she was torn between the terror of that proposition and the first, terrifying whisper of a heart that was beginning to understand. The library became her world. In the days that followed Arthur's shocking confession, Hazel retreated into its warm, leather-scented embrace, using the endless shelves as a barricade against the confusing reality that lay outside its doors. She spent hours exploring, her fingers tracing the spines of books that had slept undisturbed for years. She found first editions of Melville and Hawthorne, volumes of poetry by Keats and Shelley, so fragile they threatened to turn to dust in her hands. It was a scholar's dream, a treasure trove that spoke of a lineage far more refined than the brutal world Arthur now inhabited. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. He left her to her solitude, yet his presence was a constant, muted hum in the background of her life. He would leave a tray with a pot of tea and a plate of small sandwiches just inside the library doors for her lunch, a silent offering she would find after he had already gone. Sometimes, late at night, as she sat reading by the fire, she would hear the library doors open and close with a soft click. She would not look up, but she knew he was there, standing in the shadows at the far end of the room, simply watching her exist in the space he had given her. It was no longer the predatory observation of the public library. This was something quieter, more vulnerable. It was the watch of a lonely man gazing at a flickering candle he had brought into his cavern of a house. Slowly and hesitantly, they began to speak. It started with books. He would find her reading and ask a simple question: "Is it a good story?" Her answers were clipped at first, monosyllabic, but his interest was genuine, his questions insightful. He had read many of the books himself years ago, and remembered them with a startling clarity. They spoke of Ahab's obsession and Hester Prynne's defiance, finding a strange neutral ground in the lives of fictional characters. In these conversations, she saw glimpses of the man behind the myth, intelligent, thoughtful, and possessing a deep well of sadness that he kept carefully hidden. One afternoon, she was perched on the rolling ladder, reaching for a volume of Greek tragedies, when he entered the room. "You should be careful on that," he said, his voice holding a note of genuine concern. "I've spent half my life on ladders, Mr. Vance," she replied, her confidence growing in this one room where she felt his equal. "Arthur," he corrected her gently. "My name is Arthur." The use of his first name felt like a momentous step, a crack in the formal wall between them. "Arthur," she repeated softly, testing the shape of it on her tongue. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. "That's better." That evening, he did not remain in the shadows. He came and sat in the other leather armchair by the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't speak, merely shared the silence with her, the only sounds the crackle of the logs and the rustle of her turning page. For the first time since she had been brought to the mansion, Hazel did not feel like a captive. A strange, tentative sense of peace began to settle in her heart, a feeling so foreign and treacherous that she immediately tried to smother it. This man had stolen her life. She could not, would not, feel comfortable in his presence. But her heart, it seemed, was not listening to her head. The illusion of peace was shattered a few nights later. They were sitting in their now customary places by the fire, when the tranquility of the house was ripped apart by a sudden, violent noise from outside, the unmistakable roar of a car engine, followed by the percussive, deafening crackle of a Thompson submachine gun. Arthur was on his feet in an instant. The transformation was terrifying. The quiet, contemplative man vanished, replaced by the lethal gangster she had heard stories about. His face became a mask of cold fury, his body coiled with a deadly stillness. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Don't move from this room. Don't open the doors for anyone." He was gone before she could even process the order, moving with a silent, predatory speed that belied his size. The library doors boomed shut behind him. Hazel was left alone, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The gunfire erupted again, closer this time, punctuated by shouts and the shattering of glass. The sounds of Arthur's world, the violent, bloody world she had been sheltered from, were invading her sanctuary. She huddled in the armchair, her hands pressed over her ears, trying to block out the cacophony of the battle raging just outside her haven. Every shot felt like a physical blow, a brutal reminder that the man who spoke of poetry with her was also a master of this brutal language. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, a heavy, profound silence fell over the house, a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. She waited, her body trembling uncontrollably, until the library doors opened again. Arthur stood on the threshold. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder and splattered with something dark. His face was grim, his knuckles were bruised and bleeding, but it was his eyes that made her gasp. They were filled with a cold, terrifying fire, the eyes of a man who had just walked through hell and brought some of it back with him. He saw the look of sheer terror on her face, and the fire in his eyes died, replaced by a wave of profound regret. He shut the door and leaned his back against it, as if to physically block out the violence he had just wrought. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "You're safe." But she wasn't. She was staring at the blood on his shirt, and all her progress, all the tentative trust she had begun to feel, crumbled into dust. He was a killer, a monster. The quiet moments by the fire were a lie, a beautiful facade hiding a rotten core. Tears of fear and disillusionment streamed down her face. "This is your life," she whispered, the words choked with horror. "This violence, this death." He didn't deny it. He walked slowly towards the fireplace, slumping into the armchair opposite her, the exhaustion of the fight and the weight of her judgment pressing down on him. He ran a bloodied hand over his face. "There is a man," he began, his voice weary, hollowed out. "His name is Walter Sterling. We grew up on the same streets. We chose different paths to power. He believes sentiment is a weakness, a home, a wife. He sees you as my weakness. He will continue to try and destroy what I am trying to build here." He looked into the fire, but his gaze was 1,000 miles away, lost in a memory that was clearly agony. "He is not wrong to think it is my weakness," he said softly. "It has been my weakness before." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw with a pain so deep it seemed to pull her in. "I told you I wanted a family, Hazel. I didn't tell you that I had one. Once." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Her name was Evelyn," he said, the name a ghost on his lips. She was like the first day of spring. "We had a son, Howard." He flinched as he said the name, the coincidence a cruel twist of fate. He had her eyes. "We had a small house, far from all this. I thought I could keep that world separate. I thought I could build a wall between my life with them and the things I did to provide for them." He fell silent, the memories choking him. "Sterling saw them as leverage, a way to control me. There was a fire. It wasn't supposed to. They weren't supposed to be home." His voice broke, and for the first time, Hazel saw the impenetrable Arthur Vance completely undone. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "I lost everything," he whispered to the flames. "The fire took them, and the man I was burned with them. What was left was this, the ghost. I became what everyone feared, because I learned that fear is the only wall high enough to protect anyone. I built this house, this fortress, this empire of money and power, all to create a place so secure that nothing could ever breach its walls again." He looked up at her, his soul stripped bare. "When I saw you, so decent and good, surrounded by the only things that ever brought me peace, I thought maybe I had a second chance, a chance to build it right this time, to build a fortress of love inside the fortress of fear. But I was a fool. I brought the darkness right to your door. I put you in the same danger." Hazel sat, stunned into silence, the sound of gunfire still ringing in her ears. But now it was layered with the roar of a fire and the cries of a woman and child. His monstrousness was not born of malice, but forged in an unimaginable crucible of loss and grief. The blood on his shirt was not just the blood of his enemies. It was the echo of the blood of his family. He wasn't trying to possess her. He was desperately trying to protect her, to recreate the one thing that had ever mattered to him. Her fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a powerful, overwhelming wave of compassion. The man before her was not a simple villain. He was a tragic hero, a man haunted by ghosts, fighting a war against his own past. He had built a gilded cage, not to trap her, but because it was the only way he knew how to keep a precious thing safe. Slowly, hesitantly, she rose from her chair. She crossed the small space between them and knelt on the rug before him. She took a handkerchief from her sleeve and, with a trembling hand, she reached out and gently, so gently, wiped the blood and grime from his bruised knuckles. He flinched at her touch, his head snapping up to look at her in utter astonishment. He had expected revulsion, condemnation. He did not expect this small, profound act of grace. She said nothing. There were no words for the complex storm of emotions inside her: pity, terror, and a fragile, terrifying tendril of something else, something that felt dangerously like understanding. For now, the gesture was enough. It was a bridge across the chasm of violence, a silent acknowledgement of the wounded heart inside the monster. And in the flickering firelight, as she tended to his wounds, the balance of power in the room shifted. She was no longer just the captive. She was now the keeper of his most devastating secret. In the weeks that followed the attack, the mansion settled into a new, fragile rhythm. The shared trauma had acted as a crucible, burning away the formal distance between them. Hazel no longer addressed him as Mr. Vance, and the name Arthur on her lips became a sound as familiar as the crackle of the fire in their shared library. She found herself seeking his silent company, and he, in turn, seemed to shed a layer of his formidable armor in her presence. He taught her to play chess on a heavy marble board, and in the quiet strategy of the game, they learned the contours of each other's minds. He was a brilliant, ruthless player, but he would often pause to explain a strategy, his low voice a patient rumble in the quiet room. She, in turn, brought a softness to the cavernous house. She found a neglected conservatory, and with the help of a bewildered but willing gardener, began to bring it back to life, filling the air with the scent of jasmine and earth. For the first time, she wore one of the dresses from the wardrobe bar, simple, deep green day dress, and when Arthur saw her in it, the look in his eyes was one of such profound, quiet gratitude that it made her own heart ache with a confusing mix of emotions. She was a captive, yes, but the bars of her cage were beginning to feel less like iron and more like a protective embrace. The fear had not vanished, but it was now intertwined with a dangerous and growing affection. It was this fragile piece that Arthur shattered one evening, not with violence, but with a request. "I am hosting a party," he announced as they sat across the chessboard, "a masquerade in 2 weeks' time." Hazel's hand froze over her queen. "A party? Here? My world is built on perception," he explained, his gaze steady. "After Sterling's attack, there are whispers. They are watching to see if I am weakened. A display of confidence, of extravagance is necessary, to show them that my foundations are unshakable." "I see," she said, though she didn't. His world of shadows and power plays was still a foreign country to her. "I need a hostess," he continued, his voice dropping slightly. "I need you to stand beside me, Hazel, as the lady of this house." The request landed like a stone in her stomach. To be seen by them, by the gangsters and the corrupt politicians and the kind of people who solve their problems with machine guns. "I can't," she breathed. "Arthur, I'm a librarian. I don't know how to be ... that." He reached across the board and for the first time took her hand. His touch was not possessive, but pleading. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself. Just be there, with me. It is important." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "For us." The word hung in the air between them. Us. It was a word that both thrilled and terrified her. It implied a future, a partnership, a reality she had not dared to contemplate. And so, against her better judgment, against the screaming voice of self-preservation in her head, she heard herself agree. The night of the ball, the mansion was transformed. It blazed with light, a beacon of defiant opulence in the dark night. A jazz band, poached from the city's most popular club, filled the grand hall with a rhythm that was both decadent and alive. Champagne, forbidden by law but abundant as water, flowed from glittering fountains. The rooms were crowded with men in sharp tuxedos and women who glittered like constellations, their bodies draped in beads and silk, their laughter sharp and bright. Everyone was hidden behind a mask of feathers or velvet or cold-painted porcelain. Hazel stood before the mirror in her room, a stranger to herself. The dress Arthur had made for her was a column of sapphire blue silk that shimmered with every movement. It left her arms and back bare, a scandalous display of skin for a woman who had spent her life in high-collared blouses. Her hair, usually in its severe chignon, had been styled by a professional into soft waves that framed her face. On her vanity lay the mask, a delicate creation of silver filigree and tiny blue gems that would hide her identity, but not her eyes. She felt like an actress about to step onto a stage, terrified she would forget her lines. When Arthur came for her, he stopped dead in the doorway. He was magnificent in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his mask a simple, severe black domino that did little to hide the intensity of his gaze. He stared at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated reverence. "You are beautiful," he breathed, the words stripped of all artifice. He held out his arm. They are waiting for their queen. Walking into the ballroom on his arm felt like stepping into another world. A hush fell over the room as they descended the grand staircase, 100 masked faces turning to watch them. She could feel their whispers, their speculation. She was the ghost's new woman. Arthur held her hand tightly, a silent, reassuring pressure. He guided her through the throng, his presence a formidable shield, introducing her to no one, yet presenting her to everyone. She was his, and that was all anyone needed to know. After an hour of playing the part, of smiling until her face ached, the noise and the press of the crowd became overwhelming. Arthur was pulled into a low, serious conversation with a grim-faced man, and she saw her chance. Murmuring an excuse, she slipped away, seeking a moment of refuge. She found it on a small stone balcony, half hidden by heavy velvet curtains. The cool night air was a balm on her flushed skin. From her hiding place, she could still hear the party, but the sounds were muffled. It was from here that she overheard the conversation that would bring her world crashing down. 2 men, their masks pushed up onto their foreheads, had stepped into the alcove just beside the balcony to refill their champagne glasses. She recognized them as Stanley and Clarence, 2 of Arthur's most trusted lieutenants. "The boss looks happy tonight," Stanley said, his voice slurring slightly from the champagne. "Never seen him like this." "It's the girl. She's a looker," Clarence agreed, chuckling. "And the cleverest thing he's ever done. An absolute masterpiece of a plan." Hazel froze, her hand gripping the cold stone balustrade. "Masterpiece is right," Stanley bragged, his voice full of admiration for his boss. "Everyone else uses guns or money to get what they want. The boss? He uses their own decency against them. Who else could have cooked up a scheme that perfect? Find the one thing she'd do anything for, that pathetic old father of hers." The air turned to ice in Hazel's lungs. "I still can't believe how smoothly it went," Clarence continued, oblivious to his audience, leaking false tips to Sterling's men about the old man's investments so he'd lose his shirt, planting the idea in his head to borrow from our shark, then having our man at the company fabricate the embezzlement evidence. The whole thing, the debt, the crime, created from thin air. The girl walked right into his arms. Never had to lay a glove on her. A perfect, bloodless capture. They laughed. A low, cruel sound that echoed in the sudden roaring silence of Hazel's mind, created from thin air. The words repeated, over and over, a litany of betrayal, the debt, the crime, the ruin of her father. It was all a lie, a meticulously crafted, diabolically cruel performance. It wasn't an opportunity Arthur had seized. It was a trap he had designed and built, piece by agonizing piece. Every moment of the past weeks flashed through her mind, recast in a new, hideous light. His confession in the library, not the bearing of a lonely soul, but the masterstroke of his manipulation. His stories of his lost family, a calculated play for her sympathy. Every kind word, every shared silence, every game of chess was a lie, a carefully placed stone in the path to her gilded cage. He hadn't rescued her. He had orchestrated the disaster from which she needed rescuing. A cold, hollowing numbness spread through her, so profound it felt like death. The music from the ballroom became a grotesque, mocking dirge. The glittering lights seemed to taunt her. She had been a fool, a naive, sentimental fool who had believed in the humanity of a monster because he showed her a library and told her a sad story. The shame was a burning acid in her throat. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen, her heart turning to a shard of ice in her chest. With a supreme act of will, she forced her trembling limbs to move. She smoothed down her silk dress, adjusted her silver mask, and stepped back into the party. The mask felt like a blessing now, a shield to hide the utter devastation in her eyes. She saw him across the room, watching for her, a question in his eyes. He started towards her, a faint smile on his lips. As he approached, she looked at him, really looked at him, and a haunted, tragic man she had started to care for was gone. In his place stood Arthur the Ghost Vance, a ruthless predator, a brilliant puppet master who had played her with absolute perfection. "There you are," he said, his voice warm. "Are you all right? You look pale." She looked up into his face, into the eyes that had seemed so full of sorrow, and saw only the chilling satisfaction of a victor. She could not speak. The words would be a scream of pure liquid hatred. She simply nodded, forcing a smile onto her lips that felt like cracking glass. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just a little overwhelmed." He took her arm, tucking it possessively in his. "The night is almost over. Stay with me." She let him lead her back into the center of the room, a perfect doll on his arm. She smiled, she nodded, she played her part as the queen of his dark, glittering kingdom. But behind the silver filigree of her mask, her eyes were cold and clear. The love story was a fraud. The library was a cage. And as the jazz band played its final, mournful song, Hazel Abbott, the quiet librarian, made a silent vow. She would burn his kingdom to the ground, and she would start by escaping it. Betrayal was a cold and meticulous architect. In the days following the masquerade, Hazel moved through the mansion with a chilling new purpose. The fragile affection she had felt for Arthur had curdled into a hard, bright rage that gave her a clarity she had never known. The grief for the man she thought he was came later, in the dead of night, a silent, suffocating wave. But during the day, she was a strategist, her librarian's mind, once used to cataloguing books, now cataloguing the habits of the house, the schedules of the staff, and the weaknesses in her prison's walls. She maintained the facade with a skill that surprised even herself. She sat with Arthur in the library, played chess, and listened to his plans for the conservatory, all while a storm of pure loathing raged within her. She was a spy in the heart of the enemy's camp. He seemed to sense a change in her, a new stillness, but he misinterpreted it as a final, peaceful acceptance of her role. This fatal miscalculation would be her greatest advantage. He saw a dove settling into its cage. He did not see the hawk sharpening its talons. Her opportunity came in the form of a young, nervous footman named Clarence, the same one she had overheard on the balcony. He was jumpy and perpetually sweating, his eyes darting around as if he expected a blow at any moment. Hazel observed him and saw the cracks in his loyalty. He was a man drowning in a world too deep for him. She began to speak to him, offering small, unexpected kindnesses, a word of thanks, a shared cup of tea in the kitchen. She learned he had a sick mother, that he was sending every dollar he earned home to his family. She saw her opening. She cornered him in a quiet hallway, her voice low and direct. "I know you work for Walter Sterling," she said, the words a calculated gamble. The color drained from his face. He looked ready to bolt, but she held his gaze, her own steady and cold. "I am not going to tell Arthur," she continued. "I'm going to offer you a better deal. Help me get out of here, and I will give you enough money to take your mother anywhere you want, far from this city and these men." She showed him a diamond bracelet she had taken from the jewelry box in her room, a piece worth a small fortune. "This and more will be yours. All you have to do is leave a service door unlocked and turn a blind eye." The battle of fear and greed in the young man's eyes was short-lived. He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The plan was set. They would wait for the right moment, a night when Arthur was occupied, a night when the weather itself would provide the perfect cover. The night came a week later. A ferocious thunderstorm, which had been threatening for days, finally broke over Chicago. Rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee around the stone eaves of the mansion. The roar of the thunder was a constant, percussive barrage, loud enough to cover any sound. It was the perfect chaos. Arthur was in his study, engrossed in ledgers and phone calls, dealing with the fallout of a shipment that had been hijacked, a move undoubtedly orchestrated by Sterling. He was distracted, on edge. He had barely spoken to Hazel all evening. "I have a headache from the storm," she told him, her voice a placid sea above the roiling depths of her intent. "I think I will retire early." "Of course," he said, his eyes still on the papers before him. "Sleep well, Hazel." The casual endearment, which once might have warmed her, now felt like a brand. She went to her room, but not to sleep. She changed out of her dress and into a sturdy skirt and blouse, pulling on practical, flat-heeled shoes. She had a small satchel packed with the jewels she had taken and a few $100 in cash stashed in the conservatory. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of the storm. This was it. There was no turning back. She crept through the darkened, silent corridors of the mansion, her body a coiled spring of tension. The service door at the far end of the kitchen wing was, as promised, unlocked. The wind nearly ripped it from her hand as she pulled it open, and a blast of cold, wet air hit her like a physical blow. She slipped out into the raging storm, pulling her coat tight around her. The plan was to follow the line of the garden wall to a small gate Clarence had assured her would be unguarded. From there, it was a half-mile walk to the main road, where she could flag down a car or lose herself in the anonymity of the city. The rain was a solid wall of water soaking her in seconds. The mud sucked at her shoes, making each step a struggle. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the thrashing trees in stark, terrifying flashes. She was halfway to the gate, her lungs burning, when a hand clamped down on her arm like a vice. She screamed, but the sound was devoured by the wind. She was spun around, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw his face. It was Arthur. His hair was plastered to his skull, his fine clothes soaked through, and his face was a terrifying mask of incandescent fury and profound, heart-shattering pain. "Where do you think you are going?" he roared over the thunder, his grip like iron. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, struggling against him, her nails scratching uselessly at his hand. "You lied to me. Everything was a lie. I did it to get you here, to keep you safe," he yelled back, his voice raw with a desperation that cut through the storm. "Safe? You call this safe? You've built this cage on the ruins of my family, on my father's good name. You destroyed my life and called it love. I do love you." The words were torn from him, a confession made at the height of a hurricane, both literal and emotional. "What I did was wrong, Hazel. It was the desperate act of a man who didn't know any other way. But what I feel for you, what we have built in this house, that is real. Don't throw it away. It was never real," she sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. "It was a story you wrote, and I was just a character in it. I am taking my life back." She twisted with all her might and broke free of his grasp, stumbling backward in the mud. He took a step towards her, his hand outstretched, his face a portrait of agony. "Hazel, please, don't leave me." It was in that moment of raw, desperate confrontation, with the storm as their witness, that the world exploded in a flash of light that wasn't lightning. The distinct, deafening report of a shotgun blast echoed through the garden, followed by the splintering of wood as the small gate she had been running towards was blown off its hinges. Figures in dark coats began to pour through the opening. Walter Sterling's men. They had used the storm as cover, just as she had, their attack perfectly timed to coincide with the chaos. Clarence had not just helped her escape, he had signaled the invasion. Arthur's reaction was instantaneous. The heartbroken lover vanished, replaced by the lethal protector. He shoved Hazel behind him, his body a shield, just as another shot rang out. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled forward. "Arthur!" she screamed, her own escape forgotten, her blood running cold with a new, more potent terror. He straightened up, turning to face the intruders, one hand clutched to his side, where a dark stain was already spreading across his wet shirt. "Get back to the house," he snarled at her, his voice tight with pain. "Now," but she was paralyzed. The sight of him, wounded and bleeding for her, shattered the last of her rage, leaving behind a terrifying, undeniable truth. In the face of real, mortal danger, her first instinct was not to run away from him, but to fear for him. Another man raised his pistol, aiming it directly at her. Time seemed to slow. She saw the flash from the barrel, heard the crack of the shot. But before the bullet could find her, Arthur threw himself in front of her, a guttural roar tearing from his throat as the impact slammed him back into her. They fell together in a heap in the cold, unforgiving mud. The roar of the storm and the shouts of dying men, the last sounds she heard before the world went black. Hazel awoke to the smell of rain-soaked earth, an antiseptic. The world swam back into focus slowly, painfully. She was lying on a plush sofa in the library, a thick wool blanket tucked around her. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light that pushed back the lingering chill of the storm, which had now softened to a gentle patter against the window panes. For a confused moment, the preceding horror felt like a nightmare, a fever dream born of thunder and fear. Then she saw the dark, muddy footprints on the Persian rug and the overturned chess set, its marble pieces scattered like fallen soldiers, and she remembered. "Arthur," she whispered, the name a raw plea in her throat. She sat up, her head spinning, and saw him. He was slumped in the large leather armchair opposite her, the one that had become his throne. His head was lolled to one side, his face unnervingly pale in the firelight. A white, blood-soaked bandage was wrapped tightly around his torso, a stark contrast to the dark, wet fabric of his ruined shirt, which had been cut away. An older, grim-faced man she'd never seen before was carefully packing a medical bag. "He's alive," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The bullet passed clean through, missed anything vital. He's a stubborn ox." He looked at Hazel, his eyes sharp and assessing. "And a lucky one, it seems. He'll be weak for a while. He'll need watching." The man nodded curtly, and let himself out of the library, leaving them in a profound, echoing silence. The rage and betrayal she had felt just hours before were gone, washed away by the deluge of rain and blood. All that remained was a deep, aching terror that he might have died, and that it would have been her fault. Her escape had been the signal, her flight the catalyst for the ambush. Seeing him now, so still and vulnerable, the formidable gangster stripped of his power, she felt the last of her defenses crumble. The truth, raw and undeniable, rose up to claim her. She loved this impossible, monstrous, tragic man. She had tried to deny it, tried to hate him, but seeing him sacrifice himself for her Weiss had laid her heart bare. She rose on trembling legs and crossed to his side, sinking to her knees on the rug beside his chair. His breathing was shallow, his brow furrowed in pain, even in his unconscious state. Hesitantly, she reached out and brushed a stray lock of damp hair from his forehead. His skin was cold. At her touch, his eyelids fluttered. He blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused, until it finally settled on her face. A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost painful, crossed his features. "Hazel," he rasped, his voice weak, "you're safe." Even now, wounded and bleeding, his first thought was for her. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unstoppable. "You fool," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed sobs. "You absolute stubborn fool. You could have died." "Worth it," he whispered, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. He tried to reach for her hand, but the effort made him grimace in pain. She took his hand in both of hers, holding it tightly. It felt large and surprisingly fragile. "The others?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Sterling's men?" "Gone," he said, his eyes closing for a moment. "My men handled it. The house is secure." He had made his fortress impregnable again, but they both knew it was a hollow victory. The violence of that night had been a baptism of fire, irrevocably changing them both. He could not build the life he wanted on a foundation of blood and fear. The darkness, he commanded, would always find a way to seep through the cracks, to threaten anything beautiful he tried to build within its walls. They would never be safe here. Not really. He opened his eyes again, his gaze clear and filled with a weary, hard-won certainty. "This life," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "This house, my name, it's all a prison. I thought I needed it to protect you, but it only brought the war to your door. I was wrong." He squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "When I saw you in the mud, when I thought they might, I realized none of it matters. The money, the power, the fear. Only you." Hazel leaned her forehead against their joined hands, the tears now falling freely onto his skin. "It was all a lie, Arthur," she whispered, the last of her pain needing to be spoken. "My father, you built my cage before you even met me." "Yes," he admitted without hesitation, his voice filled with a shame that was more profound than any apology. It was the act of a coward who was afraid to lose something he hadn't even found yet. "It is the one thing I can never take back. But what I feel for you, Hazel, that was never a lie. It's the only real thing in my entire life." She looked up at him then, into the depths of his sad, honest eyes, and she saw the truth of it. He was a man who had only ever known how to take what he wanted. He had taken her, yes, but somewhere along the way, in the quiet moments between the pages of books and the strategic moves of a chess game, she had, in turn, captured him completely. She leaned in and pressed a gentle, trembling kiss to his lips. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance, of forgiveness. It tasted of rain and blood and a new, terrifying hope. He let out a shaky breath, his eyes closing in what looked like a prayer of relief. A new dawn was breaking, the first pale gray light filtering through the tall library windows, casting the scattered chess pieces in long shadows. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. In the quiet of the morning, they made a silent pact. He would not be Arthur the Ghost Vance any longer, and she would not be his captive. They would be something new together. It took him 2 weeks to recover enough strength to walk, and in that time they planned their own escape. He used his network for the last time, not to intimidate or threaten, but to create a new life. He arranged for a substantial, anonymous trust to be settled on her father, enough to ensure his comfort for the rest of his days. He signed over his empire to his most loyal second-in-command, with the sole condition that Walter Sterling be dealt with permanently, ensuring no ghosts would follow them. On a crisp, clear morning, when the autumn sun cast a golden glow over the city, they left the mansion behind. There were no grand farewells. Hazel left the jewels and the fine dresses in the wardrobe. She took only one thing, the small book of poetry she had first brought with her. Arthur was waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase, not in a fine suit, but in the simple clothes of a working man. He looked younger, the weight of his violent kingdom already lifted from his shoulders. He carried a single small suitcase. He led her not to the gleaming Packard, but to an old, dusty Ford Model T parked behind the garage. He opened the passenger door for her and then climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life with a loud, honest roar. Without a backward glance, he steered the car down the long, winding driveway, away from the stone fortress and the bloody legacy it represented. As they drove out onto the open road, the rising sun broke over the horizon, flooding the world with light. Arthur reached over and took her hand, his touch no longer that of a captor, but of a partner. She intertwined her fingers with his, her heart, once a terrified prisoner, now beating with a steady, hopeful rhythm. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were heading toward the light, leaving the ghosts of Chicago to be swallowed by the shadows behind them. True love is not found in perfection, but in the profound courage to forgive the imperfect. It teaches us that a new dawn is not about erasing a dark past, but about finding the one person brave enough to help you walk away from the shadows and into the light. Redemption is not a gift, but a choice, and the most formidable fortress is not one of stone and fear, but one built on a foundation of sacrifice and forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.